Section 23 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village, by Tickner Edwards. November, Part 2. 2. There has come a spell of chilly, overcast weather, and the long dark evenings have settled upon us at a stroke. At twilight to-day, as I came into this silent, floored, comfortable room, and lit the candles on my work-table, it seemed strange that I should do so, and yet the ordinary life and traffic of the village be still going on outside. Hitherto, so it appeared, the village quiet had fallen always before the need for candlelight. I had looked out before drawing the curtains close, and heard not a step stirring, seen the windows dark in the lower stories of the cottages, and here and there a pale light glimmering behind the drawn blinds of upper rooms. For your true Sussex villager hates to sleep in the dark. But to-night some new order of things seemed to have been suddenly ordained. Footsteps, hurried or leisurely, voices old and young, the rumble of wheels, even the distant chime of Tom Clemmer's hammer, all the sounds that go to make up the common rumour of workaday life in a village, were abroad in the air, though already the hills were lost in the gloaming. The white chrysanthemums by the garden gate were nothing but a dim blotch on the murky autumn night. I lit the candles, home-made candles of yellow beeswax, and set them on their little mats of plaited green leather. I got out a new quire of foolscap, sobering in its empty whiteness, its word-hungry look. I arranged the ruler, the old cut-glass ink-pot, the painted leaden frog that serves for paper-weight, the elephant that carries a pen-wiper as howdah, ash-tray and tobacco-jar and sheaf of favourite pipes, all in their proper stations. I drew the old oak elbow-chair sideways to the table. Sideways because that was non-committal, too squarely business-like an approach in the outset, as I knew of old time and cost, often scatters the fairies into the next county, and you may chew to shreds a whole quiverful of goose-quills before they again come crowding and whispering curiously about your ears. But having made all these exact preparations, I chanced to turn to the open window for a final look down the street, and knew at once that I was lost. It was the steady far-off song from Tom Clemmer's anvil that overcame me more than anything, and the red glow amidst the elder boughs that overhung the forge, but all else conspired in one basilisk-like lure to get me forth. The busy wending to and fro, and the cheery commerce of tongues in the darkness, footsteps and voices that I knew as well as I knew my own, twinkling lights in cottages, the illumined windows of the little sweetstuff shop, the cobbler's den, the inn, the village store, the church lit up for evensong, and the bell quietly tolling, as it seemed, somewhere far up in the black void of the sky. Again the smell of the night, that moist, earthy fragrance of decaying leaves, and tang of frost, and pungent scent of simmering fire logs from stacks new broached on these first chilly evenings in November. It all ranged itself together before me as something ever present and constant in my life that I too often disregarded, took for granted. The jumble of thatch and red-tiled roof and grey flint wall, sheep and lowing kine and cackling poultry, bevy of kindly human hearts, sharp tongues and willing hands, all wedged up together in one green crevice of the hills, and calling themselves collectively by the old South Saxon name of Windlecombe. I went first of all a few strides out over the green, and looked backward, rightly to estimate, if I could, my own part in the little communal symphony. The bluff bulk of the house, with its coven roof and many gables, stood dark against the greyer darkness of the hills, and behind it rose sable elm plumes, fast thinning under the recent autumn chills. From its windows shone lights of varying significance. There were my own red-shaded candles, with a corner of a crammed bookcase dimly visible above them. There were naked kitchen lights, with ware of polished pewter and copper glinting behind, and a pleasant clatter of crockery. There was a window where the light burnt red and low and wavering, as from a spent hearth, and a quiet ripple of music from a piano keeping it congenial company. There was the window high up in the great gable, whose flickering light cast a bunch of head shadows on the ceiling, suggestive of nursery bedtime and fairy tales round the fire. It was all very reassuring and enheartening. Yes, the old white house had its integral part to play in this good English game of neighbourhood, and played it passing well. Round Tom Clemmer's forge a group of village lads was gathered, all looking on at the work with an interest that amounted well nigh to fascination. As I came up and stood unobserved in the shadow of the elder tree, there was before me a picture in which two colours only were represented, glowing crimson and deep velvety black. Young Tom stood, pincers in hand, watching the iron in the fire. Behind him his apprentice laboured at the bellows. With every wheezy puff the furnace roared out an imprecation and spat hot cinders upon the floor. It was a large piece of metal that Tom had in work, something out of the ordinary run of his business, it seemed, and he turned it and shifted it with an anxious eye. No one spoke a word, for somehow we all knew that a crisis was coming, and we were expected to hold our tongues until it was victoriously past. At length the moment came. Tom thrust the pincers into the blaze, and drew the white-hot iron out upon the anvil. Immediately the apprentice left the bellows, seized a great hammer, and, swinging it over his head, began to let fall on the metal an unceasing rain of mighty blows. As Tom twisted and manoeuvred the glowing mass about with all the strength of his wiry arms, it lengthened, squared itself in the middle, flattened out at each end, bent into complicated curves, then turned upon itself and was united miraculously head to tail. Still gripping the writhing thing with one hand, Tom took a punch in the other and pointed it to various parts of the work, and wherever he pointed the hammer drove a bolt hole clean and true through the rose-red iron. Finally Tom lifted the finished piece above his head and came striding to the door with it. The crowd of onlookers scattered right and left. Out into the darkness he plunged, and straight to the pool by the roadside. We saw the thing poised for a moment like a mammoth firefly over the water, and then, with a roar and an angry splutter, it vanished into the pond. It was scarcely 6 o'clock, and already the night was pitch black, with a creeping chilly air from the north. It was not loitering weather. People were moving briskly on their several ways. Cottage doors were shut, and windows diamonded with moisture. Roving about with no settled purpose but to humour the neighbourly fancy, and to identify myself with the evening life of the place, I presently came, full tilt at a corner, upon Farmer Coles. "The very man," said he, barring the way jovially with his stout oak stick. "Didn't you promise me that when I killed that 4-year-old wether you'd come and take a bite along o' us? Well, 'tis a saddle to-night, and I was on the road to fetch you. Roundabout, man, and straight for the farm." Now, when a South Down flockmaster, whose pedigree sheep are famous throughout the county, bids you to his table with the announcement that the principal dish is to be mutton, there is only one thing to do, that is, if you are human and of sane mind. I turned and went along with him without demur. "Jane's sister and her man be with us," said Farmer Coles, as we left the village behind and mounted the steep lane that led to the farmhouse. "And Weevilly'll be there, and the gells be home, so we won't lack for company. I don't know as you ever met Jane's sister's man. Parrot by name. No? Wonderful well-educated man, though, he be." We found the Reverend Mr. Weevilly, a shining gem of purest water, set in the ring of hearty country faces that surrounded the drawing-room fire. The broad-shouldered, broad-faced man, with a mat of sandy beard and a very bald head, who occupied the great armchair in the corner, I judged to be Mr. Parrot. Mrs. Coles and her sister, both comfortable of mien and rigidly ceremonious of visage, sat side by side in flowing black silk gowns, knitting as for a wager. The younger members of the household, who filled the interspaces of the circle, fidgeted in a constraint of merry silence, exchanging covert glances of boredom, and all obviously pricking ears for the first sound of the dinner gong. This clanged out behind us almost at the moment of our entry into the room, providentially cutting short the first amenities of greeting, and before my fingers had done aching from Mr. Parrot's grip, I found myself sitting at the loaded board, with Mrs. Parrot's voluminous drapery overflowing me on the one side, and on the other her husband's great brown barricade of an elbow securely fencing me in. "Mutton," observed Mr. Weevilly presently, by way of filling up a pause in the conversation due to our all watching with secret anxiety Farmer Coles's attack on the joint. "Mutton, and on a Monday! You remember the little game of alliteration we played at the school treat, Mrs. Coles? Really, we could make an admirable sequence here. Mutton and Monday, and Miss Matilda sitting by my side, and if it were only March instead of—" "And we'll soon all be munching of it, sir," cried Farmer Coles. "Ha, ha, ha! That's the best hem of all. Gravy, George?" At the inclusion of her name in the sequence, the eldest Miss Coles had blushed, then let her glance demurely droop upon her chrysanthemum-wreathed bosom. It was a moment of exceeding pride and satisfaction to her, for here was Mr. Weevilly beside her, an incontestable, a beautiful fact, while Miss Sweet, for once, was half a mile away. Now she looked up coyly. "I think," she hesitated, "I could suggest a—oh, I know a lovely one." Mr. Weevilly laid down knife and fork to rub his hands delightedly. "Do tell us," he murmured. "I am positively longing to—" The eldest Miss Coles turned him glamorous eyes. "Marmaduke," she said. And I think I was the only one present to realise the whole ingenuity of the manoeuvre, for she had contrived here, in the open family circle, before a dozen people, yet with entire meekness and propriety, to address Mr. Weevilly by his Christian name. As the meal progressed and tongues became generally loosened, Mr. Parrot, whose silence, except as regarded his hearty application to his food, had so far remained unbroken, now essayed to contribute his share of the talk. His first effort was a startling one. He began, smiling over his shoulder at me. "Do you He stopped and gazed helplessly towards his wife. "Like, dear?" suggested Mrs. Parrot softly. "No, I was a-going to ask you if you lend, then?" "Emma, I don't want to borrow nothing o' the gentleman. It was just to ask if he lived, there you are, in what say, Jane?" "'Tis apple pie, George, or maybe you'd sooner try the—" "Pie, Jane, pie, my dear, pie, if you please, mum, and a double dose of sugar. They allers say, don't they, sir, as if a man has a sweetheart, dear?" "Oh, aye," laughed Mr. Parrot, suddenly inspired. He looked across the table roguishly at Mr. Weaverley and Matilda, and all glances followed his. "Ah, well, never mind, we was all young once, and—" Mrs. Coles deftly drew the fire of attention away from the absorbed, unconscious pair. "William, dear, Emma has nothing in her glass, and there you sit staring at the cheese as if it were only for show, and as wooden as you are. And do pray pass the old ale to Mr. "Oh, deplorably, deplorably so," sighed Mr. Weaverley to the rapt Matilda. "Over and over again I have remonstrated with her, but all in vain, I fear. Each time I have said, 'Mrs. Gates, if you will feed little children on new hot bread and red herrings and—' Only think of it! Beer! You will find not only their physical but their moral nature entirely—" It is strange how, in a room full of heterogeneous talk, the attention of a quiet listener flits uncontrollably from one quarter to another. Much as I was interested in Mrs. Gates's domestic policy, I lost it here, to find myself in the rickyard, taking part, against my will, in some complicated sporting affray. "And there were 3 of them, father, in the trough, and I crept up and got the gun barrel through a hole in the side of the sty, and just as the old buck rat—" And then it was Mr. Parrot again. "Emma'll tell you better than me, Jane. It came hoot-tooting around the corner, and afore I could Stop, George. Nonsense. Afore I could seize hold of the— Emma, do bide quiet. Afore I could say Jack Robinson, the old mare, she backed upon her haunches, and she—" And from Miss Matilda, "Oh, I should so love to, Mr. Weaverley. Is there a very beautiful view? And could we walk there and back in an afternoon, do you think?" And from Farmer Coles, folding up his napkin, "Well, if no one won't have no more—" The rest was lost in the rustle of Mrs. Coles's skirts as she uprose. "And now, William dear, I think we ladies will leave you to your smoke, and when you are quite ready we will have a rubber and a little music." In the drawing-room presently the farmer and his wife and Mr. and Mrs. Parrot sat down to a solemn, silent game of whist. A happy family party made a vortex of merriment in a far corner. At the piano stood Mr. Weaverley, translating into soft, melodious trifles such songs as "The Wolf" and "Hearts of Oak." As for me, I was happy in the great chair with the family portrait album, full of early Victorian photographs, which I sincerely believe to be among the most fascinating and informing productions of all that fertile reign. But after an hour of this inspiring occupation, I was suddenly roused to the contemplation of a still greater wonder. One of the card players had spoken, and that sharply. "Emma, Emma, my dear." I strolled over and watched the play. Something had happened to disturb Mr. Parrot, for though his face was turned from me, I could see that his bald head had taken on a purple hue, and gradually, as the game progressed, the mystery became clear. "Emma, my dear, Emma." It was Mr. Parrot's voice again, and this time with a sharper ring of warning and remonstrance. 2 or 3 times in the next half hour he spoke thus, and each time now I was able to detect the cause. Mrs. Parrot was cheating. Continually her neck craned for a sidelong view of her opponent's cards. She revoked unblushingly. Once I could have sworn I saw a card corner sticking out of a fold in her silken lap. The aces she seemed to be trying to mark with her thumbnail, and all the time, though Mr. Parrot got momentarily redder and more wrathful, Farmer Coles and his wife sat serenely smiling, evidently well used to dear Emma and her little harmless eccentric ways. 3. Here is a winter's day already, and still November. As I looked forth at sunrise this morning, the whole village was white with frost. I could hear the ice in the wheel ruts crackling under the tread of passers by. A single thrush piped forlornly somewhere in the dense thicket of the churchyard, and as I leaned out into the nipping blast, a word came up to me, bandied between a trudging labourer and his friend, a word that brought with it an entire new sheaf of thoughts and memories. More 'n 'alf like Christmas, bain't it, Bill? It was said but in jest, and that unthinkingly, yet by the calendar, as a glance now told me, Christmas was scarce a month away. While the sun was yet no more than a white spot in the faint gold mists of morning, I took the lane that led to the downs. It was strange to see how the frost had missed all the bright hued berries in the hedgerows, and how the ivy leaves were only rimmed with white. It was the same with the prickly holly foliage. The spines were thickly encrusted, while the dark green membrane of the leaves had given no finger hold to the frost. But the colour of the grass and dead dry herbage by the wayside was completely blotted out. Every blade and twig stood up stark and white against its fellow, and here it was easy to see which way the frozen air had been drifting all night long, because on the windward side the pale accretion was thicker. In the more exposed places it more than doubled the natural girth of the stems. Where the dew pond lay at the top of the hill, far above the swimming lowland mists, there must have been bright sunshine from the very first, for here the veneer of frost had melted into dewdrops that flashed back 1,000 prismatic rays amidst the emerald of the grass at every step. But behind each upstanding tussock the frost still held as white and thick as ever. The water, too, in the pond was still frozen over. As I came up to the rail, a flock of starlings rose whirring over my head. They had been waiting there on the sunny side of the bank for the ice to melt round the pond edges, and thither they would return to slake their morning thirst as soon as I passed on. Keen and unkindly blew the blast, so that one must keep ever moving to withstand the chill of it. Looking round me on the waste of hills, I could see that the northern slopes still retained their wintry hue, though all those facing to the sun were intensely green. Below, in the valley, only the oak woods kept their bronze stain of autumn. Every other tree, the hedges that divided ploughlands and meadows, the winding line of thicket marking the course of the river, all looked bare and dark in the glistening pallor of the sun. The river itself, between the broad water meadows, seemed like a river of ink. As I took in all the cheerless, void purity of what lay below me, thinking to myself that this indeed was winter, there came a sudden cawing and dawing high up in the frosty steel-blue dome of the sky, and here again was confirmation of that unenlivening fact. A great company of rooks and jackdaws was streaming by, but with none of its summer zest and purpose. The throng made a general progress towards the south, yet it was obviously doing little more than killing time, spinning out the business of a doubtful journey into the semblance of a morning's task. Instead of going straight forward in one steady strong tide, the birds were incessantly veering back in wide circles, crossing and recrossing each other's paths aimlessly, and weaving a mazy dark pattern on the sky. I watched this dubious host from the hilltop until it vanished in the eye of the sun, and then, fairly beaten at last by the razor-edged north wind, turned and went back to the village. It was winter again in very truth, and there was little sense or profit in blinking it. I would strike my flag now, as I had struck it often before, and the flag, with me, was the little staging of fernery that still concealed the yawning blackness of my study hearth. I pulled it all down and stowed it away, and by, when the ash logs were sizzling and glowing, and the sparks were volleying up the flue, and a living warmth pervading the room, I plucked up new heart and courage. No mirth, no cheerfulness, no healthful ease, no comfortable feel in any member, no warmth, no shine. It was all as false now as it must ever have been, and as for butterflies and bees, what but a sick fancy could crave for such delicacies out of season? Section 23.
Please subscribe to update new videos. Please share and like if you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much.